My dear friends, before we start, I asked you all to press a like and leave your comment. This will help a lot to promote this video and to release news stories as soon as possible. It's not hard for you, but it's a pleasure for me. Thank you. It all started when my good friend Kyler had this wild idea to summon the spirit of an old local legend, Pumpkin Lulu. We were hanging out one afternoon, doing what teenagers do, when Kyler suggested we try summoning the sinister figure from the stories we'd heard growing up. Pumpkin Lulu, the towering monster with a pumpkin for a head, was said to haunt the abandoned cornfields of Danton, a place we'd driven past 100 times but never dared enter. Pumpkin Lulu wasn't just your run-of-the-mill ghost. According to legend, he was once a farmer who made a terrible deal with dark forces, trading his soul for a bountiful harvest. But of course, nothing comes for free, and soon the farmer's crops turned on him. The vines wrapped around him, suffocating him and fusing a pumpkin to his head. Now, they say, he roams Danton, waiting to punish anyone who disturbs his land. Kyler was always into creepy stuff like this, and while I wasn't one for summoning evil spirits, the way he pitched it sounded thrilling in a way that teenage boredom sometimes demands. There were only 3 things we needed: an old pumpkin from the last harvest, a rusty sickle, and as Kyler critically put it, someone brave, or maybe just foolish enough, to stand in the center of the summoning circle. I'll admit, I laughed it off at first, but something in Kyler's eyes told me he wasn't joking. That's when our other friend Laura, always the skeptical one, chimed in. "You're both insane," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "There's no such thing as the Pumpkin Lulu. He's just a story to keep kids out of the cornfields." We both stared at her for a moment. "So, you're saying you're not scared to try it?" Kyler asked, raising an eyebrow. Laura didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. I wasn't sure if she believed it or if she just didn't want to back down from a challenge. And that's how we ended up standing at the edge of Danton one crisp fall afternoon, staring into the cornfields where Pumpkin Lulu was said to roam. The place looked every bit as eerie as I'd imagined. The corn stalks, withered and brown, swayed gently in the breeze. There was an unsettling silence in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath. "Well, are we doing this or not?" Laura asked, trying to sound impatient, but unable to hide the nervous edge in her voice. Kyler pulled out the old pumpkin he'd stolen from his neighbor's yard. "This is it," he said, holding it up like some kind of trophy. "We carve this, draw the symbol, and say the words. Easy, easy." I muttered under my breath, feeling a knot of anxiety twist in my stomach. But it was too late to back out now. We'd come this far. We moved deeper into the field, the corn stalks whispering around us, closing in like they had a life of their own. Kyler found a clearing, laid the pumpkin on the ground, and pulled out the sickle he'd found in his grandfather's barn. As he started carving, the setting sun cast long, twisted shadows across the ground. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Kyler didn't answer. He just kept carving, and before long, the pumpkin's face was complete. The symbol he etched into it was strange, something I didn't recognize, curved lines intersecting at odd angles. It looked ancient, like something from a forgotten time. Then, the moment came. Kyler stepped back, holding the sickle up like some sort of relic, and began reciting the words we'd found online. They were supposed to be in some old dialect, but none of us could understand them. They sounded wrong, like they didn't belong in our world. For a long moment, nothing happened. Laura crossed her arms, letting out a breath. "I told you, this is a waste of..." Suddenly, the wind picked up. The corn stalks rustled violently, and a strange sound echoed through the air. A low, deep growl, almost like something massive breathing. We froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "What the?" Kyler whispered. Then, we heard it. Heavy, slow footsteps, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged through the dirt. A cold chill ran down my spine. and I turned toward the noise, half expecting to see nothing. But I was wrong. Standing at the edge of the clearing was Pumpkin Lulu. He was exactly as the stories described him. Tall, impossibly tall, with a grotesque, grinning pumpkin where his head should have been. Vines twisted around his body, moving like they had a will of their own. And in his hand, he held an enormous scythe that glinted in the fading light. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. None of us could. "Oh my God," Lara whispered, her voice barely audible. Pumpkin Lulu took a step forward, his heavy boots crunching on the ground, and I realized we were in trouble. Serious trouble. "Rot!" Kyler shouted, snapping us out of our paralysis. We turned and bolted through the corn, our feet barely touching the ground as we tore through the stalks. The sound of Pumpkin Lulu's footsteps followed us, impossibly fast for something so large. I could hear Lara's panicked breaths behind me, Kyler's frantic shouts ahead of me. But all I could think about was the heavy footsteps getting closer. I didn't dare look back. We burst out of the cornfield and into the clearing by the road, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was still. Had we outrun him? But then, a shadow fell over us, and we looked up in horror. Pumpkin Lulu stood at the edge of the field, his grinning face watching us from the shadows. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. We told no one about what had happened. I could feel Pumpkin Lulu's presence everywhere, watching, waiting. It was like he'd marked us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our time was running out. Every night, I dreamed of the cornfields. I could hear the wind rustling the stalks, the sound of heavy footsteps drawing closer and closer. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, but the worst part was, I knew it wasn't just a dream. Kyler disappeared first. It was late one night, just after we'd been hanging out at my house. We tried to pretend everything was normal, but I could see the fear in Kyler's eyes. He was trying to be brave, but we both knew Pumpkin Lulu was coming for us. I got the call from Kyler's mom the next morning. He hadn't come home. The police found his car parked near Dandon, the driver's door wide open, but there was no sign of Kyler. Lara was next. She'd been quieter than usual, keeping to herself after Kyler disappeared. I think she knew it was only a matter of time. I tried to check in on her, but one night she just vanished. No one saw her leave. She was just gone, and now it's just me. I can feel Pumpkin Lulu's presence getting closer. Every night, I hear the footsteps outside my window. Every day, I feel his eyes on me. I know it won't be long before he comes for me, too. I don't know why he hasn't taken me yet. Maybe he's toying with me, waiting until I'm at my weakest. Or maybe he wants something else. Maybe he wants me to join him, to become part of his legend. Whatever the reason, I can't run anymore. I can't hide. Pumpkin Lulu is coming, and when he does, I'll be ready. Or maybe I already am. After Lara disappeared, my days turned into one long, anxious blur. I kept seeing shadows move in the corner of my eye, catching brief glimpses of what I feared was Pumpkin Lulu watching me. I couldn't tell anyone. Not the police, not my parents, because who would believe me? They'd think I was losing my mind, that the fear of losing my friends had pushed me into some delusional state. And maybe it had, but that didn't make Pumpkin Lulu any less real. I started skipping school, staying locked in my room. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window felt like him, just waiting outside. But that wasn't the worst of it. The dreams, or maybe they were visions, became stronger, more vivid. It was as if I was back in those cornfields every night, trapped in some nightmarish loop where Pumpkin Lulu was always just a step behind me. At first, I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, but after a few days, I stopped being afraid in the dreams. I would walk through the cornfield, waiting for him to appear, because at least then, in my dreams, I could see him coming. I could face him. In the waking world, though, the dread was unbearable. Every second, I was waiting for something that never came, until the night everything changed. It was 3 weeks since Kyler disappeared. I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight casting long shadows through the half-open blinds. My parents thought I'd been out with friends, but I hadn't spoken to anyone since Lara vanished. My phone, which used to buzz constantly, was eerily silent now. That night, I couldn't sleep, my heart pounding like it knew something terrible was about to happen. Then I heard it, the faintest whisper of a sound like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I shot upright in bed, straining to hear. For a moment, all was silent again, and I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate dragging, like someone pulling a heavy object across the gravel driveway outside. I moved to the window, barely daring to breathe, and peeked through the blinds. Nothing. The street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. But the sound persisted, growing louder, coming from the direction of the cornfield just beyond the street. My skin crawled, a wave of nausea twisting in my gut. I knew what it was. I didn't want to know, but deep down I knew. Pumpkin Lulu was coming for me. I stumbled away from the window, heart racing. There was no point running. I'd seen what happened to Kyler and Lara. He'd find me, just like he'd found them. But I couldn't just sit here waiting. If this was the end, I'd face him head on. My hands were shaking as I pulled on my shoes, grabbing the flashlight I kept on my nightstand. I was halfway down the stairs before I realized how absurd it was to go out there. What was I thinking? Walking right into the jaws of whatever this thing was? But another part of me, the part that had been living in fear for weeks, knew that if I didn't go, it wouldn't matter. He'd come inside. He'd find me no matter where I was. Outside, the air was cold, biting against my skin as I stepped onto the porch. The night was deathly quiet, the street eerily deserted. The sound was closer now, almost rhythmic, like the swaying of a pendulum. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I moved toward the cornfield, the flashlight beam bobbing with each unsteady step. The dry stalks whispered in the breeze, bending and swaying as if they were alive. My breath was shallow, each step feeling heavier than the last, like the earth itself was trying to hold me back. Then I saw him, standing at the edge of the field, just where the corn met the street, was Pumpkin Lulu. He was taller than I remembered, his twisted frame looming over me like a dark omen. The vines coiled around his body, twitching and writhing like they were alive, and his massive scythe scraped against the ground as he took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, rooted to the spot by some primal fear. My mind screamed at me to run, but it was too late. I was frozen in place, staring into the grotesque, grinning face of the creature that had haunted my nightmares. "Why?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Why me?" The Pumpkin Lulu stopped, his head tilting to one side as if considering my question. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer, but instead, he raised the scythe, the blade catching the moonlight. This was it. I was done for. But then something strange happened. He didn't strike. Instead, the vines around his body began to unwind, slithering toward me like serpents. I stumbled back, but the vines were fast, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me toward him. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled against them, but it was no use. The more I fought, the tighter they became, and then, without warning, they stopped. The Pumpkin Lulu crouched down in front of me, his grotesque face inches from mine, his hollow, glowing eyes bored into me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something human. There was a sadness there, buried deep beneath the monstrous facade. I was shaking, barely able to breathe, when a voice, low, guttural, and ancient, rumbled from the creature. "Not you," it growled, the words slow and deliberate, as though speaking was painful for it. "The deal." "The deal?" I echoed, my voice trembling. The Pumpkin Lulu nodded, the vines around me slackening just enough for me to move. "You summoned me," he rasped, his words sending chills down my spine. "I come for them." It took me a moment to understand what he meant. "Kyler." Lara, the deal we'd made, even though we hadn't realized it at the time. We called him, summoned him with a ritual, and now he was here to collect. But why hadn't he taken me? Why am I still here? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The pumpkin Lulu's gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of pity in those glowing eyes. You didn't believe, he rumbled. The others, they believed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. Kyler had been the one to lead the ritual, to carve the pumpkin and say the words. Lara, skeptical at first, had eventually given in to the fear. But I hadn't. I'd gone along with it, sure, but deep down, I hadn't believed it was real. And that's why I was still alive. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't marked like Kyler and Lara. I wasn't part of the deal, but that didn't mean I was free. I could feel it in the air, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. The pumpkin Lulu had spared me, but for how long? Go, he growled, the vines releasing their hold on my legs. Leave now. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away from the creature. The pumpkin Lulu watched me, his glowing eyes never leaving mine, until I was far enough away that I could no longer see him. Then, I ran. I didn't stop running until I was back in my room, slamming the door behind me and collapsing onto the bed. My mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had happened. The pumpkin Lulu, the deal, Kyler, and Lara. I had to tell someone. I had to warn them. But who would believe me? If I went to the police, they'd think I was crazy. If I told my parents, they'd think I was having a breakdown. No one would believe that a creature from an old legend had taken my friends. But I couldn't just do nothing. I couldn't let it happen again. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going back to Dannon. Not to face Pumpkin Lulu again, but to find out what had really happened. There had to be more to the story. Something we'd missed. Some way to undo the deal we'd made. I spent the day gathering supplies, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a few other things I thought might help. It felt like overkill, but after what I'd seen, I wasn't taking any chances. That night, just before sunset, I made my way back to the cornfield. The wind was cold, biting against my skin as I stood at the edge of the field, staring into the darkness. The corn stalks rustled in the breeze, and I could almost feel the eyes of Pumpkin Lulu watching me from the shadows. But I wasn't here to summon him. I was here to find answers. I pushed through the corn, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I made my way to the clearing where we'd performed the ritual. The pumpkin was still there, half rotted and covered in dirt, its carved face twisted into a grotesque grin. The clearing looked just as we had left it that night, except for the palpable sense of wrongness that now clung to it. Every rustle of the corn stalks seemed like a whisper, a reminder of the deal we had unknowingly made. I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I approached the decaying pumpkin. It was strange how something so harmless had unleashed such unimaginable terror. I crouched down, carefully brushing away the dirt that had settled over the pumpkin's face. The carved eyes stared back at me, mocking me, as if they knew the truth long before I did. I ran my fingers over the grooves of the carving, trying to remember every detail of the night we had performed the ritual. There had to be something we missed, something that could reverse the damage. But nothing came of mind. In frustration, I kicked the pumpkin, sending it tumbling across the clearing. It shattered against the base of a tree, its inside spilling out in a grotesque mess of seeds and rot. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, wondering what good any of this was doing. What did I think I would find out here? Some secret that would magically bring back Kyler and Lara? I was about to turn and leave when I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped around, my flashlight sweeping across the cornfield. Nothing. The wind rustled through the stalks, bending them in waves, but there was no sign of anyone or anything there. I took a step back, my nerves on edge. I knew better than to trust the quiet. The night could be deceiving, especially out here. Slowly, I began backing away, keeping my flashlight trained on the edge of the clearing. And that's when I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of the cornfield, just barely visible in the periphery of my vision. It wasn't the pumpkin Lulu, though. This figure was smaller, more human-like. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the figure stepped out from the stalks and into the moonlight. It was Lara. My mind reeled as I stared at her, my pulse quickening. She looked the Kylera as she had the night she disappeared, her clothes dirty but intact, her hair wild around her face. But something was off. Her eyes were vacant, her expression blank. "Lara," I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond. Instead, she took a few slow steps toward me, her movements jerky, unnatural. It was like watching a marionette being pulled along by invisible strings. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, staring in disbelief at the girl who had once been my friend. "Lara, what happened to you?" I whispered, taking a cautious step forward. Her head tilted slightly, as if she was trying to process my words. Then she spoke, but her voice was wrong, flat and motionless. "We made the deal." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't her voice. It was like something else was speaking through her, using her like a puppet. "What deal?" I asked, my throat dry. "What are you talking about?" Lara's eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in them. Just a hint of the girl I used to know. But then it was gone, replaced by that eerie emptiness. "He took us because we believed," she said, her voice monotone. "But you didn't." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me. It was true. I hadn't believed in the ritual. Not really. I'd gone along with it for Kyler and Lara's sake, but deep down, I thought it was all just a stupid game. And that's why I was still here. "Lara, listen to me," I said, stepping closer. "We can fix this. We can." But before I could finish, Lara's body convulsed, her eyes rolling back into her head. I took a step back, horrified as she crumpled to the ground, her limbs twitching uncontrollably. It was like watching her soul being torn from her body. Then, the cornfield behind her rustled, and I knew without looking that Pumpkin Lulu was near. I didn't wait for him to appear. I turned and ran, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I tore through the cornfield, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own panicked breaths drowned out everything else, but I could feel it. He was behind me, his presence pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. The corn stalks slapped against my face, stinging my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. Somehow, I found my way out of the cornfield and back onto the street. The familiar sight of the houses should have been comforting, but instead, they felt alien, like I had stepped into a world I no longer belonged in. My legs were shaking as I stumbled up the driveway and into my house, slamming the door behind me. My parents were out of town, thankfully, or else they would have seen the state I was in and started asking questions I couldn't answer. I collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing. Lara was gone, truly gone, and I didn't know how to save her. But there had to be a way. There had to be some way to undo what we had started. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. I didn't have much time. The Pumpkin Lulu would come for me soon. He had made it clear that while I hadn't believed in the ritual, I was still part of this, whatever it was, and now I was running out of time to figure it out. The next day, I went to the only person who might have answers. Old Man Patrick, the local recluse who lived on the edge of town. He was known for his strange, almost mystical knowledge of local legends and dark folklore. If anyone could explain what was happening, it was him. His house was a crumbling relic from another time, tucked away at the edge of the forest. The windows were boarded up, and the front porch sagged under its own weight, but the old man still lived there, rarely venturing into town. I'd only spoken to him once or twice when I was a kid, but I remembered the way he looked at me, like he knew things I couldn't possibly understand. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling. There was no response at first, just the faint creaking of the wind against the house. But then I heard the slow shuffle of footsteps approaching from the other side. The door opened a crack, and a pair of sharp, beady eyes peered out at me. "What do you want, boy?" Old man Patrick rasped, his voice gravelly and rough. "Ain't got no time for visitors." "I need your help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's about the pumpkin Lulu." At the mention of the name, Patrick's eyes narrowed. He opened the door a little wider, studying me with a suspicious glare. "Pumpkin Luluette," he muttered, scratching his chin. "Thought you kids were too smart to mess with that nonsense. We didn't know what we were doing," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "But now he's after us. He took my friends, and I think I might be next." Patrick stared at me for a long moment, then finally stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. The inside of his house was cluttered with strange artifacts, old books, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and various trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "Sit," Patrick grunted, gesturing to a worn-out chair near the fireplace. I sat down, my hands clenched in my lap as I waited for him to speak. He took his time, rummaging through a stack of papers on the table before finally sitting across from me. "You kids don't know what you've done," he said, his voice low. "The pumpkin Lulu ain't just some ghost story. He's real, older than this town, older than the people who first settled here." I swallowed hard, but we didn't mean to summon him. It was just a stupid game. "A game?" Patrick shook his head. "You're dealing with forces you can't even begin to understand. That ritual you did? It's a binding contract. Once you call him, there's no turning back." My stomach sank, but there has to be a way to stop him, to break the deal. Patrick's eyes flickered with something. Pity, maybe, or regret. "There's no stopping him. Not once he's been summoned. The only way out is to fulfill the terms of the contract." "What are the terms?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "The terms are simple," Patrick said, leaning forward. "He takes the ones who believe, the ones who truly fear him." I frowned, but I didn't believe. "Not really. That's why you're still alive," Patrick said, his gaze piercing. "But the moment you start to believe, the moment you let that fear in, he'll come for you too." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All this time, I've been running, hiding, trying to figure out how to save my friends. But the truth was, the more I feared the pumpkin Lulu, the more power I gave him over me. Patrick leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "You want my advice, boy? Leave town. Get as far away from here as you can, before it's too late." "But what about Kyler and Lara?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I can't just leave them behind." Patrick sighed, rubbing his temples. "They're gone, son. There's no bringing them back. Not unless you want to end up like them." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything Patrick had told me. Could it really be that simple? Could fear really be the key to the pumpkin Lulu's power? But even as I tried to convince myself that it was all just a myth, I could feel the fear creeping in, seeping into the edges of my thoughts. The more I tried to push it away, the stronger it became, until it was all I could think about. I had to do something, anything to stop this, to stop him.